Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and thank you all for being here and listening to what I'm about to present. I would say overall, one of my favorite places in security is really to focus on usability and the human element of security. So what I'll be presenting to you today is part rant, part observation, and maybe a little bit of whining about passwords being awful, but hopefully you learned something from it. I'll do a quick who am I. So I'm Jessy. Hi, nice to meet you. I get nervous. Sometimes I have these things. If I hear anyone saying anything mean, I might throw it. Just kidding. I have had the luck to be able to work in security communications with some really, really large technology companies. I've done a lot of security education work, a lot of awareness work, and probably my favorite part of my job is when I get to run security trainings and I get to teach the average person what all of these bits and bobs and bytes and all of this code does and how it works and what they need to know to protect themselves, their identities, and their data from everything out there on the internet. I will say right up front, I am an absolute and total password nerd. I spent some time at 1Password and we had a password manager. It's just a life thing that I'm never going to get over, and because passwords will never be killed, I will always have job security. So here's some of what we'll cover today. I definitely want to make sure we examine some of the conflicts between security and human beings because they are real and they are hard, and we don't have a lot of really good solutions quite yet. I want to take a look at some of the security concepts, some of the policies, and some of the tasks that people are asked to take care of from their point of view, especially non-technical people who aren't experts at all of this computer whiz kid stuff that we all love doing. And then finally, I want to make sure that we talk about how to improve security outcomes by closing the gap between people and all of the technology that we use. So, like I mentioned, I am an absolute total password nerd. As you see, there's a little screaming face up there. I think you can understand where I'm coming from. So I'll start with a little story. We all know that passwords are made for machines and not human beings. To be usable, a password for a person needs to be short. It needs to be something that probably can't be forgotten super easily. And that's something you know can't be something that is going to just run out of your brain in 5 seconds after you create it. Well, a few months ago, I moved into a new apartment. And with my new apartment came all of these new accounts and things I had to sign up for my internet, to pay my rent, to pay utilities, you name it. I think even my furniture delivery, I had to set up an account for. And as a password person, I was like, all right, it's fine. I have my password manager. I'll get through all of these accounts in like 20 minutes, and then I can go on a run, or I'll go cook something. Who knows? It's not going to be that hard. What actually happened is I would go to these web pages. I'd have a blank password box, a blank username, and no security rules on the side, told to me up front to tell me what I need to know or what I need to do to actually be successful at making a password. So the first time, I put in a username, and I queue up my password manager. I hit the little generate button a few times, and something that looked nice came up. Without knowing the security rules, I wasn't quite sure if it was going to work, but I entered it anyway. The thing that happened next was I got a whole bunch of really ugly little messages. No, this is wrong. No, this doesn't work. Sorry, your password, it's not quite strong enough, or really, sorry, your password's too strong because we didn't build this the way that you know it needs to be built. Now, one account, I spent 20 minutes getting the password together with. I have a password manager at my disposal, I've seen the rules, and I still can't get the stupid thing to work. And as a password nerd, I have gone from the point of thinking, all right, I've got this, to, oh my God, what was the last password that was the right answer somewhere that I can just put in here and get on with the process? Now, if I'm someone who loves hitting that button and coming up with 65-character, Queen of the Night aria-looking passwords, and I can't get it right, what chance does the average person who really just wants to get on with their day, what chance do they have? So I was pretty frustrated at this point because I didn't have the rules in advance. I tried my best. I got yelled at by a website a few million times. And then I wanted to turn around and use a weak password when I already knew better. What this made me think of was that there's a lot of information asymmetry that happens when we're asking users to do these very specific things. I had all these rules in front of me, but if I wasn't an expert, I wouldn't know why they were important. And furthermore, if I wasn't an expert and I didn't have the rules in front of me before I had already failed at my first try, why would I want to keep going on and get this particular thing right? Another thing that was particularly frustrating is that I have my own set of password rules. I'm the kind of lady who, before I even let him ask me out on a date, I asked my boyfriend what his password strategy was and how he felt about multi-factor authentication. If he said something ugly about YubiKeys, he was not going to buy me dinner. It worked out pretty well, for him at least. The thing that was really frustrating, though, is we give users all of this advice, and sometimes it's conflicting. One website says one thing, one website says another thing, and our users don't have a way to figure out what's right and what's wrong. Plus, it's really not their fault. Another thing that I get pretty stabby about is social engineering. So this is something that we all hear about all the time. Phishing is a problem, spear phishing is a problem, watering hole attacks are a problem. Everything on the internet that has a link, an attachment, or something or the other is a problem. One of the things that really stinks about social engineering from a user aspect is instead of just being able to go on with your day, you have to actually do a lot of work to figure out whether an email attachment that has been sent to you is a good email attachment or a bad email attachment. If you have no idea what a JavaScript file is or what the difference between an exe and a docx is, and you're just going to click on it, that's a huge problem. That's also a problem the vast majority of people face on a day-to-day basis. Plus, there's a lot of burden that we put on users when we expect them to start looking at email headers, to go through all of these links and go to a website to validate that the link is actually something they should click on versus not. That's a lot of extra time, and for the most part, our users aren't going to do that. And we need to understand that because it's just not something that's going to help them get through their day and accomplish their business tasks or manage whatever they're doing on the internet for their personal life. Another thing that's a problem is even if users do everything right, if they have that amazing password that they've designed with their two-factor, they can still be set up for failure by customer service teams and other things that set them up for account hijacking. There's a really kind of amazing example where in the US, one of the chief technologists for the FCC, she had her SIM card on her phone stolen. She was on her phone, she was talking to someone, and in the middle of the call, the phone just cuts out, and that's it. So she can't figure out what's going on, she can't reach her provider, she drives to the closest, I think it was AT&T store, by her house and says, hey, what happened? Why is my device not working? Well, someone walked into an AT&T store with publicly identifiable, easy-to-find information about her online, pretended to be her, and then went and set up a whole bunch of phone accounts with the newest, most expensive, fancy iPhone that you can imagine. While most people would say, well, hey, wait a second, didn't she set up a password or an extra link of security on her account? This isn't something that's actually her fault. The person who was at the last line of defense really was the customer service agent. And instead of setting up a system where there were a few more roadblocks in place, the customer service agent suddenly had to be in a position where he or she needed to be an expert in whether a license was counterfeit or not, be an expert in whether utility bills and other identifiable documentation were real or not. And that's a lot of work to put on someone who, in the US, is probably making $10 an hour just to make sure that they can answer support questions when someone comes to the store. And then finally, I've sort of touched on this. Another problem we have with social engineering is that there's a lot of publicly available information about people. Anytime that there is a Facebook meme, your average user is not going to think, hey, maybe I shouldn't tell everyone what my favorite color is, what my first dog's name was, or any other kind of tips or hints that might end up being a security question. This is particularly frustrating because users don't know, and they're never going to sit in a class where they learn that they need to treat those security questions like they're a second set of passwords that they keep secret. It's not like you can turn around and revoke your mother's maiden name, though my mom might actually like that. I'll have to check with her. These things are particularly frustrating because the users expect and trust companies to take care of this information, and they think that by providing the right answer for them that they won't forget, they're doing a good thing. More often than not, they have no way of knowing that something's wrong until it's way too late. Another thing that is particularly frustrating for the average user is that we have lots of rules in security, and we have lots and lots of best practices, but sometimes, even as practitioners and experts, we can't agree on the basics. You could pull 10 security people in a room and say, what is 1 + 1? Somebody's going to say 4, someone else is going to say 2, and someone else is going to say, well, it's 365.5. It really is incomprehensible sometimes that as professionals and practitioners, we can't agree on the basics, but these things make it a lot harder for our users to figure out their way through the internet. One of my favorite studies actually comes from Google. It's a paper that was presented at Usenix, and it was called No One Can Hack My Mind. It is a comparison of experts and non-experts and their security practices. One of the things that I thought was fascinating here is that if you look to the right side, these are all the things that security professionals would recommend that an average user do to be safe on the internet. So you're supposed to patch everything. You're supposed to use strong passwords. Except, those rules aren't exactly easy to follow for every single person who is behind a computer, especially if they have some very specific and painful disincentives when they do update software. In my neighborhood in San Francisco, I have what I call an old lady gang. I basically adopted all of the grandmas on my block, and one by one, I have very slowly gone through security education with them because I know that one of the biggest threats that they face is phishing and phone scams. So when I got to know the ladies on my street, I talked to them and I'd say, well, hey, wait a second. This iPad, it's running on iOS 6. We're on iOS 9. That's really old software. And I get to speaking to my neighbors, and they say, well, here's the thing, I tried that new one, and I can't see very well because they've changed a font. Or, I tried updating it, but every time I update my device, I have to relearn everything. And this is really frustrating, because all I want to do is use this stupid iPad so that I can keep in touch with my family, I can keep in touch with some of my friends, and I can go annoy my grandkids on Facebook. That's it. And I want to enjoy this technology, but every time I turn the thing on, something breaks, something changes, or I just can't rely on it. Another thing that I think is really interesting about this study is that the average user thinks that changing passwords frequently is something that you have to do to be secure online. Now, if you think about this, where could the average person have gotten this piece of information? What I have found in some of my work with teachers and with students is that anytime there's an acceptable use policy or there's an information security policy in front of them, they consider that to be an instructive document. So if you're at work and you have to change your password every 6 weeks, or you're in university and you have to change it every month because some rule somewhere says so, that's probably the most important account that you have in your life. If you're at university, especially in the US, you spend a lot of money to have access to that account. So if the password rules say that a strong password is the word password with $signs and all kinds of other zeros and leet speak in it, you're probably going to trust that and apply that to the rest of your life. Now, we as security experts know that you shouldn't change passwords frequently. In the US, NIST has made some wonderful password rules that say don't change them until you've gotten to a point where you think that your password might have been exposed or breached. For the average user, we're probably not going to get a little flag or a notification anywhere that says, hey, this was breached, until we all get that email from a company saying reset your password. But still, it's fascinating that this piece of information made its way from what people learned at work to what people actually do at home. Another thing that's particularly frustrating, especially with security rules, is we say don't a lot. We tell people what not to do and how not to do it, but we don't actually step back and say, here's a better way. Instead of saying don't click that link, it might be better just to say, hey, take another look at that link, or maybe it's not a good idea to trust things if you don't recognize the sender. Just giving someone a bunch of rules and saying no, 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 no doesn't keep them from actually doing the action that you don't want them to do anyway. Sometimes I find that when we have a really big security breach or we have an incident like this wonderful ransom worm that's ripping its way through the planet, there's a lot of people who say, oh, just do this. Except when it comes to things like patching, sometimes just do this is incredibly hard, and there are a lot of people involved. Or there's some technical debt involved, and to actually patch, you have to consider replacing a whole system. With my old lady gang in my neighborhood, one of my old ladies has a very expensive embroidery machine, and another has a really old quilting machine. If either of them decided to update their software to the latest version, they have to pay for that piece of software again, or they brick the device. In one case, that's a $10,000 machine to do nothing but make quilts, which are very pretty, I have to say, but that's a really, really expensive cost to just put on the user because someone redesigned an operating system and some DLL files and some custom drivers don't work anymore. Another thing we tend to do pretty often, we have lots of always and never statements. Now, for anyone who's ever been in a fight with your significant other, always and never are two big no-no words. Because when you say, well, you always do this, that's going to start a fight. Or if you say, I'm never going to do this, or I never do this, or you never do this, that's going to cause another kind of fight. When we use language like that with users, they tend to take those messages and internalize them in ways that do not help us out as security people at all. If you say, for example, well, you should never write a password down, I can't tell you how many hundreds of people have come to me and said, well, I was trying to make a password, but my security guy said I couldn't write it down on a piece of paper, and I wasn't sure what to do next because I had 18 rules that I had to follow, and I didn't have a scratch sheet, or I didn't feel safe or comfortable writing down what I needed to on a scratch sheet of paper to get my password done. That's a little bit scary because if we say always and never, we're not necessarily giving our users a really strong basis for a security model in their heads and helping them really feel comfortable in making decisions on their own. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can start doing to make security work better for human beings. One of the first things that I am a little bit biased about is I think that we have to have a lot more proactive communication with users. We have to give people the important information that they need before they have to make a decision. Not afterwards, like in the case with me yelling at my computer and my passwords, to make sure that some of that information asymmetry between us, the technologists who know all the stuff, and them, the users who are kind of not sure what's going on, is a little bit more equitable. We need to make sure that we're helping people build models for making decisions instead of just giving them a list of things 1 through 10 to do and hoping that they get it right. Another thing we really need to be good at doing is avoiding jargon and really highly technical language when we are talking to non-experts and to non-technical people. Something that I tend to hear and something that makes my eyes roll backwards in the right meeting is once in a while you'll get someone who speaks in what I call alphabet soup. All of a sudden, when someone's asked to explain the impact of a vulnerability in a security team meeting, you start hearing PGP, GPG, and all kinds of other protocols and crazy things. To everyone else in that meeting who has no idea what those protocols are, they're completely lost. Their eyes have pretty much glazed over. You can go like this and no blinking happens. And they have no way of participating in that conversation. If you're in a conversation like that, try dropping some of the protocols and try leaving some contextual clues so that people can figure out what's going on. You can say PGP, that really crazy encryption tool that's hard to use, in a sentence and give someone at least a little bit of information to help them guide their way through. Another thing that I'm really passionate about with the proactive communication is making sure that we're using tangible and universal examples to make really hard ideas easier for people to understand. So one way of doing this, and perhaps my favorite example, is to compare technology to architecture. If I am in front of a room of students and they have no idea what that internet thing is and how it works, they just know Facebook and Instagram, I have a really good way of explaining what all of that invisible architecture looks like by likening it to a house or to architecture. If I walk into a room of teachers and say, okay, let's think about this piece of technology as a building. What if Facebook were a house that had to fit over 1 billion people in it? How would that work? Suddenly, all of the things that we do as security people and all of this stuff that we build that they can't see makes sense in all kinds of ways. Especially in using that example with architecture, I've never known someone who has not been in a building. I've never known someone who didn't understand the difference between a tent and a brick house. So when you're talking about the maturity level of different kinds of technology, you can refer to something like a protocol as a tent, or sticking a newspaper over your head and hoping that you don't get completely drenched in a rainstorm. Another thing that's really important when we're working with non-technical users is making sure that they get pretty continuous support and positive reinforcement. One of the hardest things to do is to take someone who doesn't know anything about technology and then make them care about all of these crazy arcane rules that we have to follow to make sure that things are safe and private. Something that's really important in supporting users is making sure that you are not setting them up for failure, whether it is through crazy password strategies or through not having two-factor authentication set up for them. It's really important to make sure there is room for people to fail, and that when they do fail, they feel comfortable at least coming to the security team or coming to someone and saying, uh-oh, I did something. Please help me out of this mess. Something else that's really important is making sure that the policies, whether they're on a website or whether they are the book of policies that you pass to someone in your organization, make sure that they are clear and that they provide a little bit of education background. If you just tell people to do 10 things, but you don't give them the reasoning why, they're most likely not going to be able to see why this matters for them and why they should buy into all of this extra work that you have given them. Another thing that's really great, if you look at policy, it's great to stick a little joke in there once in a while. I happen to like sticking jokes in places that are completely unexpected. I like to refer to two-factor authentication as two-raptor authentication. I think in my documentation somewhere it says that the raptors will eat the attacker's face off, something like that. That's a good way to make sure that people are paying attention. And then another thing that's really important, especially when you're transitioning users and the average person from insecure habits to secure practices, is to just make sure that you have built some structure or some project management. With my old lady gang, something that I realized was that no matter how enthusiastic these women, who are smart, no matter how enthusiastic they were, my lawyer lady wanted to throw her computer out of the window after the first 3 days of using a password manager because she didn't get it. Something that worked out really well was that I had this entire group of women working together to go from not using password managers to using password managers, from never having WhatsApp or Signal to comparing fingerprints with each other just for fun. It's really important to make sure that when you're doing the education piece, you encourage people to practice. You are consistently providing messaging and education to them throughout the process, because if we've never ever had the opportunity to learn about security before, which most people don't, it's not like we all have a required course that we have to sit through before we turn 18 or 20 years old and learn all of the rules of the universe. If someone doesn't have those things, it's really important to make sure to understand that repetition is the key to information sticking in their brains. And then finally, if we want to take care of, or at least fix some of these problems that we're having between human beings and security, we need to start looking to other disciplines that aren't just technology for inspiration to solve security problems. A lot of my nerd friends back home in California are all about the economics of security. They have pretty much gotten me hooked on taking all of the inequities that we have in security and all of the functional parts and mapping them to economics and building behavioral economic models and other things to kind of help understand why things are the way they are. Another is communication. Users are not going to pay attention to a giant wall of text that tells them tons and tons and tons of information that they're going to forget. Some things that are really great with communications are content strategy, learning that being short, concise, brief is excellent, putting jokes in there, and then just thinking really strategically about how you're actually sharing your message. Will something go across better in a video or in an email with a couple of funny emoji? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the culture of your organization. But once again, looking at these other professions for ways to solve the problems we have is a great way to move forward. Another thing to be really, really considerate about is making sure that you're looking at issues from both sides of the table. Something that we tend to see a lot in security is there's victim blaming in the wake of major incidents. If you go on Twitter and look at anything that's been said in the past 3 days, we're having wars over patching, and if it's your fault that you got attacked because you didn't patch or not. Speaking poorly of end users and victims does not solve our security problems, and it doesn't make anything we do easier or better. So if we can just skip that and actually work towards that root cause and look at how to flip the situation to keep incidents and issues from happening again, we're in a much better place than if we are arguing with one another all the time. And then finally, be really creative. Think about new security models and solutions that don't set people up for failure. Something I consider a lot is that living in San Francisco and in the middle of the Silicon Valley, I have a lot of tech companies around me. And a lot of the security structures and the security models that we are exporting to other industries don't work for them because they're not tech companies. They have legacy devices. They have all kinds of business requirements that tech companies just don't have. And trying to follow a model where you hire a team of 50 engineers when your base vertical that you're working from is retail or biochemical, that's not necessarily going to be something that helps you accomplish your business goals. So just to wrap up, there are a few things that if you want to try doing in the next few weeks, the next few months, to try to set that balance between people and security straight, here they are. In the next week, think about how you're using jargon or highly technical terms with non-experts. If you simplify language and use metaphors, especially like architecture, sometimes even using the weather as a metaphor works, that might set that playing field, at least with your business colleagues and other people in other parts of your organization, a little bit more level. Over the next month, try taking a look at some of the security policies and the instructional documents, or even awareness training that you might have in your organization. A lot of people get really bored by having to click through the same training with the same multiple choice questions and the same videos every year. So see if there's a way where you can take that content and do something a little bit more fun with it. I have to say for me, using XKCD comics with the developers and the nerds has been wildly successful. And then with other parts of organizations I've worked in, specifically when I've worked with PR teams, looking at what's happening on television and making security jokes about it makes that information much more sticky, and it makes it resound a little bit more. No one will ever forget the time that I made jokes about Kim Kardashian, knowing that she shouldn't geotag her photos. And then over the next few months, look to see if there's any room to add training or tools to empower users to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem with your team. What that really means is looking at the way that your particular security system is set up and seeing if there's room to incentivize people for either taking extra time to learn about security, for trying out new tools, or for just being successful at avoiding some terrible attack, or for reporting something when it went wrong. Thank you so much for listening to me rant and whine a little bit about passwords. Favorite thing in the world. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Jessy. I kept thinking while you were talking that using antivirus software was kind of a rare success among the 90% of the internet users that are idiots and don't know anything about security. And I suppose the reason is because you install it and you forget about it. It updates in the background. But now people think that they're secure because, oh, we've got antivirus, so, nothing will go wrong. How do you inculcate things like two-factor, basic sanitary email practices, using password managers? How do you do something that's more complex, get that through to people who really don't have a clue what they're doing?
So sometimes it takes a lot of work. With antivirus, this is a war I've been fighting probably since I was in university. The easiest way that I can get people to stop trusting antivirus is to ask them if they knew how flu vaccines are made. If you pick the wrong sample the year that you were manufacturing a flu vaccine and you inoculate the entire population with round A instead of round B, everyone gets sick even though you tried. Yep. And when I'm able to pull some of the stories of viruses and things being not caught for 5 or 10 years by researchers, that can, at least inside of an organization, make people wake up and realize, okay, I need to do other things. In terms of a password manager, probably the easiest thing to do is to explain to people how simple it is to crack a password and how simple it is to trick their passwords out of them. If I explain to someone that if they use one password across 350 different sites, if that password gets lost one time, all 350 sites, including their email, their mortgage, their banking, are going to be up for grabs by some person they've never met who just wants their money or their contacts to do their worst.
And you should probably point out that their passwords have already been leaked multiple times because, I'm on 4 or 5 lists of cracks, where my password's been leaked.
Yeah,
so making people aware that
them aware
this happens and it will happen to everyone.
Making them aware that it happens frequently helps. I also find that humor really helps too. It's a terrible joke, but I really like puppies, and when Yahoo let out 1.5 billion puppies, that's what I called the passwords. No one wants to be the person who lets their puppy out of the front gate. No one wants to lose 1.5 billion puppies. It's a silly example, but it got attention in some of the right ways, especially with the little kids who all thought that I would not know their password was monkey.
Yeah, no, indeed. Any questions from the floor? Yes, sir, over here. Can we have a microphone up front here? Gentleman over there.
Hi, thank you. I know there's been a lot of debate in the security industry around this password manager program that a lot of people use. I just wanted to get an indication from the floor how many people actually use a password manager, if they can just put their hands up.
I can't stick my feet up, but
okay, so it's
like
some
extra.
30%. And based on all these people, are you all using two-factor authentication on your password manager? Because if your one password gets compromised, all your passwords get compromised.
So I would say to that, some password managers don't have two-factor authentication. I can say at 1Password we didn't because it wouldn't actually provide an extra line of defense. All of our data was stored locally up until we launched 1Password for teams and 1Password for families. The presence of two-factor authentication, especially for users, is really tricky because some users hear, oh, I've got my two-factor turned on, that means I'm protected from everything. Something we all need to work on quite a bit is making sure that our users have a realistic expectation and understanding of what happens when they do use that two-factor. Most people don't realize it's good for a narrow subset of attacks. Right now, what's really popular is phishing and credential theft, and that happens to be the most useful in those situations, but two-factor is not going to protect them from fancy things like O-days and worms and all of these other threats that we have to defend from.
Any other questions? Do I see any hands? No. In that case, Jessy, thank you very much for your time and for an informative, fascinating talk. And we hope to see you back in South Africa sometime soon.
Thank you.